schönen guten Nachmittag nach Österreich und good morning to our speakers in Canada. Mein Name ist Gregor Postel, ich bin der österreichische Wirtschaftsdelegierte in Toronto, Kanada und darf Sie heute herzlich begrüßen zu unserer Webinar-Reihe Lebensmittel und alkoholfreie Getränke erfolgreich nach Kanada exportieren. Ja, wir sind heute bei unserem dritten Teil angelangt. Und zwar heute haben wir Webinar zu dem Thema regulatorische Richtlinien. Da gibt es zwei Teile. Heute der Part 1, Etikettierung, Verpackung, CETA und Zoll. Und ich darf wieder darauf hinweisen, dass das Webinar im Rahmen der Go International Initiative durchgeführt wird. Eine Initiative gemeinsam mit dem Bundesministerium für Arbeit und Wirtschaft und der Wirtschaftskammer Österreich. Zunächst ein paar Housekeeping-Regelungen. Das Webinar wird aufgezeichnet. Der Link zur Aufzeichnung und die Vortragsunterlagen erhalten Sie demnächst. Wir bitten Sie, das Mikrofon auszuschalten, als auch die Kamera, weil eben das Webinar aufgezeichnet wird. Sollten Sie technische Probleme haben, dann schreiben Sie das bitte in den Chat. Der Chat ist auch dazu da, Ihre Fragen hineinzuschreiben, die bereits schon während des Webinars auftauchen. Sollten Sie in späterer Folge Fragen haben, kein Problem. Wir würden dann gerne diese Fragen dann in weiterer Folge per E-Mail beantworten. Zur heutigen Agenda. Es gibt eine kurze Einleitung. Wir haben Präsentationen von Expertinnen und Experten und wie schon vorher gesagt, eine Q&A-Session. Ich darf daher kurz Ihnen unsere Sprecher nennen. Es ist Stuart Greenfield, Erin Taraborelli und Christian Sivier. Zunächst zu Herrn Stuart Greenfield. Er ist Leiter der Business Development bei Suez Nutraceutical, SNI, hat über 30 Jahre schon Berufserfahrung bei kundenorientierter Geschäftsentwicklung, blickt auf eine 20-jährige Expertise im Bereich Marktkonformität zurück, ist bestens geeignet, Sie zu unterstützen im Bereich multinationalen Einzelhandel, aber auch bei Nischenmärkten und ist spezialisiert bei Markteinführungen nicht nur in Kanada, sondern auch in den USA und hat auch eine globale Erfahrung in diesem Bereich. Unsere nächste Sprecherin ist Erin Taraborelli. Sie ist Leiterin für Regulierungsangelegenheiten bei Suez Nutraceutical, hat 20 Jahre schon Berufserfahrung im Bereich von Regulierungen in US-amerikanischen und kanadischen Märkten und ist vor allem steht für Sie zur Verfügung bei Unterstützung bei komplexen regulatorischen Herausforderungen und bei der Expansion in neuen Märkten. Unser letzter Sprecher wird dann Christian Sivier heißen. Er ist Gründer der Beratungsfirma Solimbex, die sich auf Unterstützung bei Import und Export spezialisiert hat. Er ist 30 Jahre bereits in diesem Bereich tätig, hilft und beratet kleinen und Mittelunternehmen bei internationalen Expansion und ist vor allem ein Experte zu den Themen Logistik, Zoll, rechtliche Aspekte des internationalen Handels, Freihandelsabkommen, Supply Chain Management. Dazu bietet er regelmäßig über das Jahr verteilt Vorträge und Seminare an und er ist ein akkreditierter CPMT-Trainer. And now I would like to switch once again to our speakers, and I would like to give the floor to Erin Taraborelli for her presentation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Advantage Austria for inviting us to speak today on Canadian food labeling regulations. My name is Erin Taraborelli, and I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs at SNI. A little disclaimer first, this presentation media is educational in nature and is not intended for broad public distribution. The technical content contained in this presentation is current as of its date of presentation and is presented for information purposes only. It is not intended to be, nor should it be construed as legal advice. Selling your product in Canada requires not only that your product be fully bilingual, but also that a long list of packaging regulations be met, such as type height, claims, a compliant nutrition facts table, and ingredient lists. Each mandatory label element has their own regulations, guidance, and formatting requirements, and each voluntary claim has criteria that must be met as well. And if these criteria are not met, it can trigger a labeling violation from CFIA. And depending on the severity of the violation, corrective action may be as simple as updating your artwork for the next production run, or as severe as a product recall, which is most often the result of allergen issues. The following presentation is a very high-level overview of these labeling regulations, and it really only scratches the surface of how to ensure compliance. And at the end, I will talk a little bit about S&I Can Help. Today, we will be talking about the regulatory framework in Canada, Canadian food labeling regulations, our new front-of-pack nutrition labeling, product classification, and a little bit about supplemented foods and natural health products. It's always a good idea to start with some context, so let's look at the regulatory framework around foods in Canada. The government departments which regulate foods are Health Canada, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, most often known as CFIA, and when you're importing into Canada, the Canadian Border Services Agency as well. Health Canada and the CFIA are responsible for administering the regulations and the standards under those acts at the top, the Canadian Food and Drugs Act and the Safe Food for Canadians Act. The regulations define how those acts must be applied and will be enforced. And the CFIA primarily is responsible for the enforcement of all health and safety requirements in both acts. Of special note to this group will be the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, which are still very new to us. These are all-encompassing regulations that govern primarily the safety of food commodities imported to, exported from, and interprovincially traded within Canada. They impact Canadian food businesses who import, manufacture, process, treat, preserve, grade, package, store and handle a meat product in its imported condition for inspection by the CFIA, but also foreign suppliers exporting to Canada. In addition to some labeling requirements, there are three key aspects to the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, which is import licensing, preventive control plans, and traceability. And it is very important to work with an SFC licensed importer that understands all parts of these regulations to ensure that your food products meet all applicable requirements of our SFCR. So moving on to the most technical part of the presentation is the labeling that is required for most prepackaged foods in Canada. Many types of foods have very specific labeling requirements that go above and beyond our discussion today, and that is why it's very important to partner with someone that has the expertise to help you with your specific commodity. An overarching requirement that touches all parts of the label is the languages. As there are two national languages here in Canada, English and French, all mandatory elements must be present in those languages. Our federal regulation for Canada as a whole dictates that all mandatory label elements plus certain voluntary label elements must be bilingual. Both languages must meet the minimum type heights, but they can be different sizes. Some voluntary texts such as romance copy or recipes may be in English only. However, if sold in the Canadian province of Quebec, the Charter of the French language applies. French is the only official language of Quebec and must be given prominence everywhere, including food labeling. All information on the label, mandatory or voluntary, must be bilingual, and the French must be at least the same size and prominence as English. Generally, clients are looking to sell nationally, or at least have that option in the future. So we do recommend having a fully bilingual Quebec compliant label, especially since Quebec represents 23% of Canada's population. Most labels in Canada are fully bilingual, with both English and French appearing in the same type height and prominence. It is important to note that Canadian French is different than France French. So be sure to have those translations completed by a Quebecois translator. And this goes without saying, but please don't use Google Translate for your Canadian label copy. Other languages other than English and French may be used on the label, but the nutrition facts table can only be present in English and French. Here is an example of a label containing the mandatory labeling requirements for all prepackaged food products for sale in Canada. There are, of course, a couple exemptions to every rule, but these do apply to most foods sold under normal conditions. And this includes the common name, the net quantity, a nutrition facts table, a list of ingredients, the name and address, and some products may also be subject to date marking and commodity-specific labeling. And we'll go into these a bit more in detail. So a common name, a legal name is required to be on the front panel of the label. So the front panel of the label is also called the principal display panel, or the PDP. The appropriate common name could be a descriptive name or one found in our regulations. The regulations describe some standards of identity for products such as jam, chocolate, ketchup, or ice cream that include ingredient requirements. Products that might be known by one name may have another regulated name in Canada, so it is very important to review our standards. And the common name does have minimum type height. The other label element required on the PDP, the front panel, is the net quantity. And this is the amount of the product in the package in weight for solids, volume for liquids, or count for certain products. It is subject to specific rounding and tolerances, as well as regulated formatting, such as the minimum type height, based on the area of that primary display panel. There are exemptions, including catch weight products that are sold to retail and prepackaged individual servings of food served with meals or snacks, such as sweetener packets or little creamers. Now we move on to the nutrition facts table, which provides our consumers with nutritional information for the food. The nutrition is always declared per one serving, which is a regulated amount for the specific type of product. This will include the metric amount in grams or milliliters and a household measure such as number of pieces or a portion of a cup. And you can see here our default nutrition facts table format, which was updated fairly recently in our regulations, but there are dozens of templates that could be used depending on the package shape, size, and the nutrient content of the food. It is very important to determine the right one for your product. Generally, the table must be shown exactly as is shown in the regulations, and there's very little flexibility. Canadian daily value percentages are also declared, and there are rounding rules for these and every nutrient. The nutrition facts table may be placed anywhere on the product package, including the bottom. There are a few exemptions to declare a nutrition facts table, for example, foods in very, very small packages and some single ingredient meats. Next is the ingredient list. Most food requires a list of all ingredients in the product declared by their common names in descending order by weight, including subcomponents. This can be placed on any panel except for the bottom. Fairly new regulations include extremely prescriptive formatting, including the font, type height, color, even the spacing between the rows of text. The ingredient list must be separated from other label text by lines or a box. A big change recently was the sugar grouping requirement. Instead of having each type of sugar ingredient, for example, sugar, honey, corn syrup, listed individually in an ingredient list, all sugar-based ingredients must be grouped together in the ingredient list and then put in that descending order by weight. And the purpose of this requirement was to highlight the less commonly known sugar-based ingredients and to show consumers how much sugar they're actually ingesting. So here's an example of what a Canadian ingredient list might have looked like 5 years ago and what that ingredient list will look like now. You can see how the changes, including black text on a white background and the mixed case lettering, really increase the readability for Canadian consumers. And you can also see how grouping the sugar-based ingredients here brings that group of sugar-based ingredients right to the top of the list, indicating the true amount of sugar in the product. And we can't emphasize more the importance of ensuring the Canadian priority allergens are declared correctly on your ingredient list. And the 12 priority allergens are egg, milk, mustard, peanuts, crustaceans and mollusks, fish, sesame, soy, sulfites, that's added sulfites, tree nuts, wheat and triticale, and gluten sources. And they must be declared by name in the ingredient list and or in a contain statement at the end of the list. Precautionary allergen statements like may contain are not required, but are permitted when it's determined to be justified by the company. The name and principal place of business of the responsible company must also be declared on the label. The company can be Canadian or foreign, and it may be the person who has manufactured, prepared, produced, stored, packaged, or labeled the food, or the person or company for whom the package was prepared or manufactured or labeled. And this may be placed anywhere on the label except for the bottom. As you know, regulations are constantly changing and new ones are always being added. And this is our newest regulation. In July of 2022, a new law was published requiring front of package, or we say FOP, nutrition symbol labeling for certain foods in order to better inform consumers about the foods they buy. A symbol is now required on prepackaged foods that meet or exceed set levels for nutrients of concern, sodium, sugars, and saturated fat, based on the percent daily value for that nutrient in a particular amount of the food. Depending on the regulated serving size of the product, the threshold could be 10%, 15%, or 30% of the daily value. For example, crackers with a serving size of 30 grams will have a threshold of 10%. Beverages with a serving size of 375 mils will have a threshold of 15%. And a main dish like macaroni and cheese that is intended for a whole meal will have a threshold of 30%. And that symbol must be shown on the front panel, the PDP, and has specific placement and formatting rules, including the size of the symbol, the font inside the symbol, and the amount of empty space around it. Some exemptions do apply to these regulations, such as sweetening agents when they're sold as such, like honey, pure honey, or foods that have a health benefit, like yogurt. And the compliance date for this new rule is January 1st, 2026. Products imported, manufactured in Canada, or packaged at retail before this date can continue to be sold on store shelves until the end of that shelf life. For products that are manufactured or imported before that date, they must comply with the regulations. The nutrition symbol can be printed directly on a label or applied as a sticker. If it's a sticker, it must be able to withstand any of the normal conditions that the product might be exposed to until it reaches the final consumer. Here's some examples straight from Health Canada guidance. It shows exactly how the nutrition symbols might be applied to combination packages or products that have an English front panel and a French back panel. There are many different conditions of use, and it's important to get all properly assessed before you go to market. In addition to those mandatory label elements, of course, most products carry voluntary statements that are intended to promote the product to consumers and explain what makes the product stand out from those competitors. These can include nutrient content claims like low fat or high in protein, health claims like support your immune system, or consumer value claims that speak to other qualities of the food or how or where it was processed, like gluten-free, organic, non-GMO, vegan, no preservatives, or fresh. Certain Canadian regulations dictate specific criteria that foods need to meet for some of these claims, and written guidance from Health Canada or CFIA provide information on what substantiation would be required in order to not mislead the consumer. One of the services that S&I provides is product classification. Different classifications of products must meet different regulations, and the classification of product in one country may not extend to other countries. The labeling regulations I've spoken about so far have applied to conventional foods, but not all edible products are conventional foods, of course, and product classification is not always straightforward with many criteria to consider. For example, product composition, what ingredients are in the product representation, how are these products marketed to consumers, product format, do they look like a conventional food, and public perception and history of use. How have these products been used for historically? A product that includes ingredients like vitamins, minerals, amino acids, herbals, caffeine may fall into categories of supplemented foods or natural health products. Supplemented foods are foods with in a conventional food format with one or more approved supplemental ingredients, those added for purposes other than nutrition, like caffeine, amino acids, or vitamins and minerals. Examples of supplemented foods include beverages with added vitamins and minerals, caffeinated energy drinks, or granola bars with added vitamins. The list of permitted supplemental ingredients is not very long. It's a brand new regulation and they will be adding to it as they go. And each supplemental ingredient has maximum limits depending on the food format. For example, energy drinks have a maximum limit of caffeine of 400 parts per million or 180 milligrams per total serving. But juices and candy cannot contain any caffeine at all. These products must follow specific formulation parameters and labeling regulations, which may include cautionary statements, but these do not require pre-approval from Health Canada. Here's an example of, this is just a mock-up of what a product might look like. You can see here the three main differences in labeling for supplemented foods. A supplemented food caution identifier is required when the amount of at least one supplemented ingredient exceeds a threshold, and this must be on the PDP, the front panel. The supplemented food facts table, which provides information about the levels of intentionally added supplemental ingredients, is there, and the cautionary statements, which might be required, again, based on the level of the ingredients. Which brings us to the products that are in traditional food supplement format. Supplements such as probiotics, herbal remedies, amino acids, vitamins and minerals, homeopathic, and traditional Chinese medicines that are generally not a conventional food format and are intended to restore or maintain good health are regulated as natural health products. Regulations set out requirements for the manufacturing, packaging, labeling, storing, importing, distributing, and selling, as well as clinical trials involving humans. Canadian manufacturers or the importers require Health Canada issued site licenses, and the natural health products require product licenses before they can be sold. And Health Canada pre-approval can take between 3 months and over a year, depending on the type of application and your product. That brings us to the conclusion of the presentation. And at the beginning, I mentioned the risk of CFIA enforcement. Any type of corrective action can negatively impact your brand, from the financial cost, unfulfilled production runs, to customer perception and damaged brand identity. The smart choice is to do it correctly when first launching a product to ensure it's done right and to mitigate any potential risk. And working with an expert is the smartest way to go. With S&I, you can be sure that your product will be compliant when it hits the Canadian market, and we can handle all aspects of go-to-market tasks that are not even limited to product classification, as I was talking about, formula compliance review, claims consultation, nutrition facts table generation using software, translations, of course, packaging, artwork compliance. However, we can also offer graphic design through our creative services team and even clinical trial management and design. Navigating the Canadian regulations is a challenge, but our team is here to help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rinda Rabarelli. It was very interesting to listen to your presentation. I think there were a lot of interesting things which, since not all of them are clear to Austrian companies exporting food and beverages to Canada. But this leads me now to our next speaker, Christian Sivier, our expert in customs and imports of foods to Canada. And I would like to give now the floor to Christian. Christian, please start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herr Brossel, and thank you for the invitation to speak to our distinguished audience this morning or this afternoon in Austria. Congratulations to Erin for the great presentation on the food labeling regulations. They're quite tricky indeed. And so I'm going to touch on, as you see on the slide here, I'm going to touch on the free trade agreement and I'll talk a little bit about the import regulations more on the customs side. We'll touch a bit on CFIA as well. And so on the next slide, I usually introduce myself, but I don't need to spend time on this slide because Herr Brossel introduced me earlier. So thank you for that again. Briefly, I might mention two publications at the bottom of the screen here. If you see the references to Inside Logistics and Supply Professional, I just wanted to share these names with you. They are Canadian publications that have interesting content on supply chain management, importing, exporting, etc., etc. And so that's why I like to mention them if you're looking for references or for information. They're easily accessible and they're free. And so very briefly, I'd like to recap a little bit on the CETA Free Trade Agreement, just remind everyone that it is in effect. It has been in effect since 2017, September 21st. And it provides free duty-free entry for most European products, most Austrian products, including foodstuffs. So it's been in effect already for 7 years. And however, why I'd like to mention it again, even though 7 years is a long time, is because it's been my experience that there's some companies that still don't know that we have a free trade agreement in effect. And I've seen statistics also from Eurostat and from the Canadian government to the effect that the CETA free trade agreement is not fully utilized by Canadian and European companies. And so that's why we thought it'd be interesting just to recap on the CETA agreement. And so most products originating from Europe, including Austria, of course, come in duty-free in Canada. There's some exceptions. So the main exceptions really are the goods that are covered by what we call here tariff rate quotas, which refers to the fact that in Canada we have this this rule or this regulation by which the Canadian government regulates the quantity as well as the pricing and the of dairy products, poultry products, and eggs. And so that's done in a way to protect the Canadian industries, these Canadian industries. And so there's very high rates of very high tariffs to import these products in Canada to protect the Canadian domestic industry. And so in the CETA agreement, we negotiated an opening of important quantities of dairy, poultry, and egg products to come in duty-free in Canada. However, there's limits, there's quotas, and so that's why we call them tariff rate quotas. So if you're in any of these industries, it can be a bit tricky. There's limitations to what we can do. There's certain processes to follow that are quite bureaucratic, shall we say. And the second element I wanted to mention as part of the exceptions, shall we say, is for wines and spirits. And so I'll touch on that actually on the next slide. And so to give us a feeling for the savings that are generated by the CETA Free Trade Agreement, particularly when it comes to food, I wanted to share with you an example or several examples of the tariff that are payable in Canada when we import some of these food preparations. So as you can see, the tariffs or the customs duties amount to average about 10% on foodstuffs. For other products like textiles or footwear, they're much higher. And so that's basically the savings that is generated by the CETA Free Trade Agreement. The two little wheels, I'm sure you're familiar with, at the top refer to the fact that we have a number of geographic indicators that are protected under the CETA Free Trade Agreement. And so it's worth mentioning as well. And so the question I wanted to clarify here, or the point I wanted to clarify was, I mentioned that wines and spirits are an exception to the rule for the CETA duty-free allowance in Canada. And that's because in Canada, the importation and distribution of alcoholic beverages, wines, spirits, beers, etc., are regulated, not federally regulated, they are regulated in each province. So each province have their own monopoly to import and distribute these alcoholic beverages, these wines and spirits. And so in Quebec, it's the SAQ. In Ontario, it's the LCBO. In British Columbia, it's the liquor distribution branch of BC, etc. So if you're in that type of products, then in a nutshell, what we could say is that Canada is actually not one country, but each province or territory is like a separate country, because if you want to distribute alcoholic beverages in Ontario, you have to go through the Ontario Liquor Control Board. And then if you want to do it in Quebec, you have to go through the SAQ. So each province has its own process and regulations and a monopoly. So it is also an exception to the CETA agreement, in addition to the dairy products that we mentioned earlier. So on this slide, I want to give you a snapshot of the main components of the CETA Free Trade Agreement. In order to take advantage and to benefit from this duty-free allowance, what we need to do is, first of all, is become familiar with the rules of origin, because, you know, in all free trade agreements, there's rules of origin that are sometimes a bit complex, that tell us what we need to meet, you know, in terms of the eligibility of the product. And that's mainly to say that a certain proportion of foreign content is allowed, but we need to we must not exceed a certain percentage of foreign content in our products. It also sometimes calls for the transformation of a product. So it's okay to use imported ingredients, however, you need to transform them into a different product. So that's what the rules of origin refer to. They enable us to have a certain percentage of foreign content and still qualify under the free trade agreement. And so the first step is go and look at the rule of origin for our particular product, make sure we comply. Once we comply, once we verify that we comply, then we would issue this origin certification, the origin declaration that you see here on the screen. You see, you know, what it's supposed to look like. And so, and that origin certification, we need to show it on our commercial documentation, on our commercial invoice, or on a separate certificate of origin if we want so, in order for the product to enter Canada duty-free. And there's a threshold that I wanted to mention as well, is the 6,000 euros threshold, over which you need to be registered under the REC system. So the REC system has been in effect for some time in Europe, so I'm confident that most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with that. And so, aside from the general rules of origin that we have to look up and make sure our products comply, there's also one that says that if we don't have more than 10% of foreign content, then our products are qualified automatically. It's called the de minimis exemption. So these are the broad parameters of the important elements to know about when we want to export to Canada and when we want to make sure we comply with the rules of origin and that our products come in duty-free in Canada. And so the first, the customs aspect is handled by the Canada Border Services Agency. Here I give you on the slide, I show a very brief outline of the documentation that's required for shipments coming into Canada. The main documentation obviously is a commercial invoice, and that's where the origin certification should be shown. If there is for some foodstuffs, of course, there could be a requirement to issue a sanitary certificate or a phyto certificate for plant products. And then the import declaration, that would be handled by the customs broker upon arrival, the spediteur. And so that's the main requirement to come into Canada to fulfill the obligations of customs, which is not called customs in Canada, it's called the Canada Border Services Agency. And the second requirement to be aware of, and Erin already mentioned it, so I don't need to spend time on this, is the fact that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency regulates all food imports into Canada. So the way it works is when goods arrive, we do a declaration to the customs authorities, to the Canada Border Services Agency, as well as a declaration to the CFIA. And these two agencies have to release the shipment in order to be able to for the goods to enter. And so what I want to mention here very briefly on the CFIA, the Safe Food for Canadian Act, is the fact that, and Erin mentioned the fact that all food importers in Canada need to have an SFC license. And so what I want to point out to you for your information is that it's possible for an Austrian company to apply for an importer license, a safe food for Canadian license, when we become then a non-resident importer. So it is possible to do that. It's not just, these licenses are not only issued to Canadian importers, they can be issued to foreign suppliers. And so that's the first thing I wanted to mention. And the other thing I wanted to mention about CFIA is the fact that they have an interesting database that's called the AIRS database that enables you to look up on the CFIA website what are the regulations or the restrictions or the requirements by product. So it's organized by product, based on the HS code, and it will tell you for this product that's the information that's needed or that's the documentation that's needed. So that's what I wanted to share with you briefly here today, the fact that this AIRS tutorial portal on the CFIA website is quite helpful when we begin the process of trying to figure out, what are the requirements in Canada for my product. As far as dairy products, we talked about that a moment ago. All I wanted to highlight here is the fact that if you're intending on exporting dairy products to Canada, it's a relatively bureaucratic process. You need to have or the importer needs to have a license that's issued by Global Affairs. So you see, it's not the Canada Border Services Agency, it's not the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, it's Global Affairs that issues the licenses for the quotas for dairy products. It's not possible for a foreign company to get a quota on cheese. It's reserved to Canadian companies. And so one interesting fact that I wanted to share with you is the fact that the Canadian companies that hold quotas for cheese imports, that information is publicly available. So this would be, I guess, your potential customers, right? The Canadian companies that have a quota for cheese imports issued by Global Affairs. So it's possible to look up that information on the Global Affairs website, which I think is kind of interesting when we're looking for, market information and when we want to team up with potential partners. And so one thing I wanted to share with you as well before getting to the end of my presentation is the fact that it's possible to sell DDP in Canada. DDP is an Incoterm that I presume most of you are familiar with. It enables the foreign company to be the importer of record in Canada. Now, it's quite demanding. It's also a little bit heavy on a bit tricky as far as the regulations are concerned. However, it is possible, and that's what I wanted to share with you, the fact that you could sell directly to a Canadian retailer, for example, and you don't necessarily have to go through an importer. You could be a non-resident importer in Canada. It's possible. It's technical and demanding, but it is possible, and that's what I wanted to share with you. Also, since I mentioned earlier that it's possible for a foreign company to have an SFC license issued by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And so you could have stock, you could have inventory in Canada in your name without having to have without having to set up a company in Canada. You could do this as a non-resident importer. One thing that you have to do is if you want to be a non-resident importer in Canada, is you have to register for the GST, which is similar to the VAT in Europe. So from the distribution side, what I wanted to point out to you is the fact that Canada is a great country, is a huge country, as you probably know. However, it's not very densely populated. And so you see on the map here at the bottom, you see that the Canadian population is very thinly spread out from east to west along the US border. Most of the population is living along the US border. There's nobody living north of that. There are very few people, very little population. So it does present sometimes some challenges on the distribution of products. And I think the key here is to, when you begin your research, your approach is to be focusing on what we call the Quebec to Windsor corridor, which is where the Canadian population is concentrated. This is also where you have the most infrastructure, and so that's kind of, I think, a key element to when you want to begin, looking at the Canadian market potential. That would be, I think, the prime market, which doesn't mean that there isn't interesting opportunities in Western Canada, in Alberta or BC or Manitoba. However, it's something to look into carefully, because distribution costs can be quite high if we don't select the right port of entry, for example. And so that brings me to the end of what I had presented for the Canadian import process. I want to end very briefly on something that I like to present to European companies, is the fact that Canada could be a great entry point for North America, for the Canadian market, but also for the US market. And I know several European companies that have done that have started developing business in Canada, and particularly thanks to the free trade agreement that we have, the CETA free trade agreement, which enables us to bring our products, European products in Canada, duty free. And so several companies start with the Canadian market, and then from a base in Canada, then they start developing the market in the US. So it's possible, and it's a good strategy for some companies, for some products. It does not necessarily work for everybody, but it's something to think about. And that's why is that possible also is because, in Canada is doing 3/4 of its exports to the US. So therefore, it's a huge market for Canadian industries, and therefore there's very efficient distribution services between Canada and the US, because there's a huge volume of goods moving all the time. So it's very efficient to supply the US market from a Canadian base, and that's what I wanted to share with you today. I know it may not be that obvious for food products, but I still wanted to mention it as a good option, depending on the kind of product you're selling. And so you see, Canada is very close to the US. We saw the map earlier of the Canadian population being located all along the US border. Here, I wanted to show you how close we are, for example, to the state of New York. If you're in Montreal, at the top here on the top right-hand side, you're an hour away from the US border in Plattsburgh. If you're in Toronto, on the left side, you're a couple of hours away from Buffalo and Niagara Falls in the state of New York. So it is something to keep in mind if you are not already selling in the US. If you're already in the US, of course, it's a different story. But if you're not doing any business in the US, it's a very good way to do it is to do the Canadian market first, and then from a Canadian base, look at the US market potential and start by distributing your product from a Canadian base. So that was the other element I wanted to share with you today. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention. I hope this was interesting and informative, and I look forward to exchanging with you during our question period. So thank you so much for your attention, and I hope to see some of you at the CL Food Show in Montreal in May.
Well, thank you, Christian, for your very interesting presentation. As you said, yes, Canada could be a good starting point to come to the North American market, also due to the CETA agreement, which makes easier to export goods with European origin to Canada because there are no duties, and then Canada can be used as a springboard to the US market. But now let me come to the question answer session. So I would also ask Erin and Stuart to switch on their camera and their microphone so that the audience can see us. We have already got some questions before the webinar, but I still hope there will be some further questions from the audience. So one question probably for Erin or for Stuart, what we got, what are some pitfalls or mistakes that international producers make when labeling their products for the Canadian market, and how they can avoid these issues? Can you give us some recommendations, some advice?
Yeah, sure. So number one, ensuring that their labels are fully compliant, making sure their formulas are compliant. There are some additives that are permitted in the other parts of the world that are not permitted in Canada, or that have specific upper limits for different types of products. So ensuring that the formula is compliant, first of all. And then the label, there are so many tiny little details that are required for Canada. So having that reviewed by an expert is key for sure. Some claims that are made in other parts of the world have different criteria in Canada. So ensuring that the substantiation has been met for the Canadian regulations is very important. I'll say one of the number one things from a formulation standpoint, in Canada, all wheat flour that is used in a product must be enriched to Canadian standards. It is not permitted to sell wheat flour, like processed wheat flour, that has not been enriched. So we've had a number of companies come to us because they've had problems at the border from the CBSA or the CFIA because they have had their products actually tested to determine whether the flour has been enriched or not. So there are so many tiny things like this that it's impossible to know if you're not an expert in Canadian regulations.
I would just quickly add that from my experience, what I see very common is a missed allergen. People who are developing their labels outside of Canada, their point of reference on allergens is their own country's allergens. And sometimes because Canada has its own unique list, some of the Canadian specific allergens are missed. Soy is often, I think mustard is missed. So it's good to have it checked by a professional who works with those allergens on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, Erin, you mentioned CBSA, which stands for Canadian Border Service Agency. So maybe one question for Christian. What are the main challenges with CBSA, an Austrian company is importing food or beverages to Canada. Can you give us an example of what should they take into consideration when dealing with the CBSA?
Well, with CBSA, I think the what is missing sometimes is the origin certification, and that's because sometimes exporters don't realize that. Let's say you're exporting a product that's was made, produced in Austria. So you just say country of origin Austria, and in the context of the free trade agreement, it's not sufficient. Yes, the product could be of origin Austria, but you need to have the little phrase, the sentence that refers to the CETA free trade agreement that confirms that yes, the product is of Austrian origin, but also it meets the rules of origin. So I think this is sometimes the nuance, the distinction, the detail that people miss is have the precise origin certification on the commercial invoice that refers to the free trade agreement, and that does not have to be on a separate document. It can be incorporated in your commercial invoice, for example. It's the most practical way of doing it. So I would say that's what's missing sometimes, as well as sometimes companies don't fully understand how the rules of origin work. And so that's also sometimes an issue.
Thank you. I've got another question, maybe for Aaron or for Stuart. There were a question raised, are there any certain packaging necessary for frozen meat? Do you know something about this?
Yes, there are so many. As I mentioned, the regulations that I went through really are applicable to all types of food categories, but meat regulations have a lot of specific regulations that are specifically for meat. It's especially important for imported meat, but yes, there are a number of labeling requirements for meat. I mean, too many to really name, but in some cases, the meat protein has to be declared on the front panel. We often have meat standards that are not the same as the naming, the nomenclature of meat products in other countries. We have even down to the part of the animal that is used might give a specific Canadian name for the meat product. Certain additives can only be used for certain types of meat. So from formulation issues there, we require the stamp. So depending on where the product is from, the issuing stamp of the meat inspection certificate needs to be on the package. The country of origin needs to be on the front panel, close to the name of the product. So I could go through this for probably an hour, but yes, there are significant requirements for meat labeling.
Yes, here a lot of homework to do for Austrian companies, especially if they want to import frozen meat from Austria to Canada. Maybe another question for Christian. You showed us Canada, most of the population is living next to the US border, and you showed also a graphic that 75% of the Canadian export is going to US. So would you say, is it rather easy to export food from Canada to US, or should there be taking anything into consideration before bringing food already exported from Canada to US?
Yeah, so it's a very good point, Herr Porsel, and I wanted to make it to give a snapshot of the options, of the possibilities. The proximity of the U.S. market is a great asset for Canada in a way, because European companies can start doing business in Canada, and then from here attack, the U.S. market. It's very convenient. However, it's we need to be very much aware of the U.S. regulations, and so that opens another requirements. So to export food products in the USA, then you have to be registered with the Food and Drug Administration of the US, the FDA, for most products. In some cases, the US Department of Agriculture will be involved, depending on the product. So it's still heavy on regulations. And so it needs a lot of preparation. But from a purely logistics point of view, thanks to the proximity, it is doable. But it is heavy on regulations, and because we're entering a new market, so we have then to follow the rules of that market.
Thank you. Talking about the rules and regulation, Aaron Stewart, can you recommend some resources or websites where Austrian companies before contacting you can find out some basic information regarding regulations and labeling of foods? Could you name us something?
Yeah, absolutely. The number one resource to check is the CFIA's industry labeling tool. So that provides in clear English, like plain language, not the regulatory language that we commonly see, a breakdown of every regulation and guidance for every label element. So that's the number one resource that I recommend. So if you just type in CFIA industry labeling tool, you'll absolutely hit that in Google.
Okay, perfect. At the moment, I don't see any further questions. That's why I would just come to the last part of the webinar. First of all, I want to thank our speakers for their time and for their very fruitful presentations. I want to tell the audience, and now I switch to German. Wir haben noch ein Webinar. Das finale Webinar findet am 26. März statt. Part 2, Lizenzen und Mustersendungen. Wir haben aber auch weitere Webinare. Es wurde gesprochen über die De Minimis-Regelung. Güter, die weniger als $800 wert sind, können zollfrei von Kanada in die USA exportiert werden. Das werden wir auch näher besprechen bei unserem Webinar zu E-Commerce am 4. April. Aber damit Sie wissen, was Sie erwartet, welche Sprecher beim nächsten Mal, das ist wieder Erwin Dabarelli, Robert Cowie und Leanne Lutomski. Alle drei sind von Source Nutraceutical. Hier haben Sie noch die Kontaktdaten unserer heutigen Sprecher. Und bevor ich jetzt dann zu den Kontaktdaten komme von unserem Büro, es gibt nicht nur die Initiative Go International, die dieses Webinar fördert, sondern Go International unterstützt generell österreichische Firmen, die neu auf den Markt kommen. Ich glaube, einige, die heute zuhören, kennen das Vehikel, einige vielleicht nicht. Das heißt, wenn Sie neu in den Markt kommen, dann haben Sie die Möglichkeit, über Go International eine Förderung zu beantragen. Da können Sie Reisekosten, Aufenthaltskosten, aber auch Marktrecherchen oder Marketingkosten sich fördern lassen. Schauen Sie sich das genauer an unter www.go-international.at. Dort finden Sie einige Informationen, wo Sie eine finanzielle Unterstützung bekommen können, wenn Sie in neue Märkte exportieren wollen. Und damit darf ich mich heute bei Ihnen bedanken. Once again, a big thank to our speakers today. And I hope to see you next time on the March 26th, once again, with our last webinar regarding food and beverages importing to Canada. Thanks a lot, alles Gute und schönen Nachmittag nach Wien.
Vielen Dank und tschüss.